You seeing the screen share okay, Andy?
Sure. Yeah.
Excellent.
Is this the beginning?
Yep. So
Good.
thank you. Thank you for all those thumbs that are coming up. Okay, so our presentation this evening is divided into 4 different parts. And if we are successful, we'll provide you with some conceptual tools, some practical tools, some ways of thinking about our students' identities that help us to acknowledge what's distinctive about their identities, but also find ways to help us to include them so that they have a strong sense of belonging in our schools. And as we often like to do in our professional presentations, Andy and I like to ask educators to start with yourselves. So right now, either in the chat box or on a piece of legal paper, if someone was to chat with you and to ask you, well, what are 3 aspects of your identity that are important to you? What do you think that you would say? Could you please jot that down either in the chat box or on a piece of paper that you keep confidential? All right, thank you. We don't want to spend too much time on this. We want you to think, though, about aspects of identity that might go beyond those that we are most commonly hearing about. So before there was identity politics, there was identity. And identity included many different things. It didn't only include the more obvious markers of race and gender and social class. It also could include your family relationship. Maybe some of you wrote down that your identity was as a high school principal or as a kindergarten teacher or as a mother or a father or a twin or as a cancer survivor. So what we really want to try and do in the discussion is to open up the panorama so that we can explore identity from many different perspectives. Now, one question here is, why do we particularly care about that? Let me just see if I can get this to move. Oh, here we go.
Hi.
Why care about identity? Who cares at all? We're in schools. We care about academic achievement, right? So for many years, this was really a focus in education, was student achievement. However, if we ask students, so this is from Ontario, Canada, now about 7 years ago, if we ask them, well, what do you hope your school could provide for you? Not just in terms of the academic achievement, but in a sense of helping you to feel good, helping you to feel like you can flourish, then students come up with a lot of different things that go far beyond the academic mission of the school. So this is just an infographic that an artist did based on conversations with students throughout Ontario. And if you look at this well-being chart, you can see stuff like all gender washrooms, you can see celebrations of diversity, you can see inclusion for students with all different kinds of identities, an effort to get past bullying. And so here's an interesting historical moment that we're going through. We seem to be moving from just narrow focus on achievement into well-being, and then to address our students' well-being, we have to address their identities as well. So that's the moment that we think that we're in right now. So we care about identities because we care about our students. And as part of that, we also need to take care of ourselves. So some of you in your courses in psychology and studies, you may have come across Erik Erikson's 8 stages of identity development over time. I won't review all of these, but I just want to highlight 2 of them. If you look at the chart here, one of the things that Erikson did is he said that in each of these 8 stages of life, people have to resolve some confusion, some difficulties. And if you look at the green area right in the middle, you see that our adolescents grapple with identity versus role confusion. So this should not be any surprise for us. Every 9th grade teacher, every 7th grade teacher knows this, right? That the kids are struggling to consolidate an identity. And if we do a good job, we'll help them with that. If we don't pay attention, they'll experience role confusion, which can have a lot of negative impacts on their learning. But for all of you who are listening to this presentation, it's important for us also to situate ourselves in this chart. I think one of the most powerful things that I ever heard an educator say when I was in Darwin, Australia, several years ago, this was a gentleman who was around 60 years old. He said, you know, my whole life I've had a sense that I know who I am, but now towards the end of my career, I'm not so sure. So this is an individual who is at the top stage of that chart there, integrity versus despair. So this is something for us all to think about. Where are we in our current identity formation? So again, just like with the previous chat, if you could either enter in a few key words into the chat or on perhaps a legal pad that's right next to you, please. Okay, so what about Andy and me? How are we kind of figuring into this? In fact, you could kind of ask yourself, what are a couple of old white guys doing writing a book about identity? I mean, what do we really know about this issue? And so we want to say a little bit in terms of how we come to all of our work. And we endeavor in all of our work to spend a lot of time working cheek by jowl with educators in schools and grappling with the subjects that they think are most important. So here is the new book on identity and two previous books that Andy and I wrote together. The one that you see on the left, The 5 Paths of Student Engagement, comes from working with a network of remote rural schools in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. This was called the Rural Innovation for Student Engagement Network. So we work with educators who care about their students' engagement, and that's what we write about. The book in the middle is based on our work in Ontario, where the government had established a new priority of young people's well-being. So we go into the schools, we talk to the educators, we listen to the young people, and we write about well-being in schools. Now, the surprise for us was that sometimes you're studying something that's going on in schools and you stumble into something else. And the something else that we stumbled into had to do with identity. And so we'll be sharing more about that in the rest of this presentation. Andy, over to you.
Yeah, just go back one slide, would you, Dennis, before we come to this. So the issue is here is, we're not like psychologists who sit in a laboratory and come up with things that have been important to us for the last 30 years and follow them relentlessly and then approach schools and ask us to do that with us. But rather, particularly over the last 10 years, we've been following what schools and systems are doing, the sense that they make of it. And we're professors. So the bizarre thing is, we're paid to hang around with people, watch what they do, listen to them, engage with them, and read stuff. And when we read this stuff and get into a field, we really look at the problem areas as well as the possibilities. So our relationship with people is one of friendship and support, but also one of criticism as part of that friendship, much like you get from your brothers or your sisters, for example. And this is what we feel in all three cases we bring to the work, that we're not sort of on one side or the other side, or even in between, but we're kind of up and off to one side a bit with how we approach these topics. And we hope you'll find that this is how we approach the issue of identity, which is very divided right now between left and right. A huge article today in the New York Times about the Audubon Society. Audubon was an owner of 9 slaves. And so should Audubon be cancelled from his leadership and his contribution to the life of birds, to ornithology, to being outdoors, or should his name be taken away? Washington State has already taken his name away from their branch of the society. And if you follow the chat on this, it's hugely controversial on both sides. So we're trying to listen openly to these issues and bring what we hope in our schools and beyond them is a unique, distinct, and I guess we call it radical common sense perspective to these kinds of issues. So Dennis, if we could go to the next slide, please. So one of the first things that we bring is there's more to all of us, including Dennis and I. And if you read the book, you'll see this. There's more to all of us than meets the eye. What you see isn't always what you get. So Canadians will probably recognize this picture in front of you. This is a Canadian rap artist who's a winner of many awards in the US and around the world for music, Drake. You'll see that I'm called Andy, by the way, because I think having one name is so cool rather than having two names. So this is Drake, like Madonna or Prince. And Drake is, when you look at Drake, you say, well, what is Drake? Well, Drake is obviously black. Drake is also many other things in terms of his own self-identification. Drake is Jewish. Drake is a rap singer, musician. And Drake is also an advocate of what he calls the 416. The 416 is the Toronto area phone code. And you might think that's a really odd thing to identify yourself with. But in saying that, he's really bucking against the fact that people like Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Mike Myers, all Canadian entertainment celebrities had to go to Los Angeles or New York in order to make it big. And in saying is advocating for the 416 is really saying something about Canadian identity versus American cultural identity. All these things are going on with Drake. He celebrates them. Most of the people who know Drake or love his music celebrate them. He's not one thing, he's many things. It's his, as Walt Whitman, the poet, put it, we're all multitudes. There are many aspects to our identity and to our experience. These are sometimes things to celebrate. Sometimes they're things that intersect with our race and our poverty that sort of amplify how marginalized we can become. And sometimes they're contradictory. And we'll see in a few minutes and throughout the book how these things open up aspects of our identity, that things to celebrate in some ways, probably problematic in other ways. So next slide, Dennis, please. And the next one. So somebody who helps us get into this a bit is a Canadian academic called Shirley Moore. Shirley Moore is at Simon Fraser University and has written a very short, practical, and insightful and sometimes quite witty book called, and it's a good title, called One Without the Other. And she talks about inclusion. And she represents how we think about inclusion often through these 5 different circles. And so if you'd look at those for a moment, and then again, you can put this in the chat box, or you can write it down for yourself, but just quickly spend 30 seconds or a minute or so. What do you see going on in these different circles in terms of how we think about inclusion? What do you see going on here? So what do we see going on, just looking across them? But really the most important thing is not necessarily to share, but to reflect right now. Yeah, green, the dominant color, diversity, segregation, insiders, outsiders. Most aren't really inclusion, multicolors are outsiders. Yeah, this is outside inclusion, inner inclusion. This is right. So Shirley Moore is talking about many kinds of inclusion as we generally think about inclusion now, not only special needs, but also language, race, poverty, many aspects to this. And on the left, she's in a world where most people are normal and people outside are weird. And then next to the left, most people are normal, but we care for people outside. We might set up special schools, for example. In the middle, we've got most people are normal, but now we try to do something inside the school. We might have a separate class or a separate group inside the class. And then as we move along towards the right, we've now got most people are not green. Most people, there are some other colors as well. And so we start to think about culturally responsive teaching in relation to perhaps particular immigrant groups or language groups or racial groups, for example. And then the most challenging one on the right-hand side is that there's no such thing as normal. There's no such thing as normal. We're all unique. We're all different. We might want to question this and say, well, perhaps we need to focus to some extent on what we have in common as well as what we have that's different. Perhaps she goes too far with this particular graphic representation. But it raises the important point about what is normal, what is not normal. And then could we go to the next slide, Dennis? So we go back quite a long way here to the 1960s to a psychiatrist, R.D. Laing from Scotland, who talked about the divided self, to a Canadian sociologist who moved to America called Irving Goffman. And in each of these ways, each of these people, the next slide, Dennis, each of these people raise the question about what is it like when we're treated in relation to one aspect of our identity that overrides all the others. Goffman called it a master status. And this part of our identity is seen as negative. And that many of us, as a result of that, live a life where we have to hide who we are. LGBTQ people have to hide their sexuality or their gender identity. Mixed race people try to pass as white because it's easier to do that than the opposite. I'm hard of hearing, and one of the ways that the hard of hearing disguise their deafness at a party is to talk very loudly all the time, so that you never have to listen. Old people, a very simple thing, but old people. When you're going to restaurants, have you noticed how if you're over 65, they shuffle you to the back of the restaurant so that new people coming in can't see that there's practically dead people sitting in the front of the restaurant that would discourage new diners? Or they move you near the galley or the toilets, for example, because when you walk in, what they see first is your age, and they respond to you in terms of your age. And these are minor embarrassments and humiliations. But when you're Black or LGBTQ, for example, or brown or an immigrant, these things can be utterly overwhelming in terms of how you're dealt with. And so people have to hide who they are. And that is damaging not only to the people themselves, but it becomes damaging to people around them when they live what R.D. Laing called this divided self, which people experience who cannot conform to the majority or dominant or overwhelming conceptions of what people should be in our societies and in our schools. So one thing we talk about in our book, next slide, Dennis, is there are all kinds of oppression in our society, and exclusion and marginalization. And we need to confront all of these openly and honestly. So some are very much on the bandwidth within society and within our schools, are much talked about, and they have to do with race or indigenous identity, who've suffered massive problems because of intergenerational trauma, or immigrant status, for example. Immigrants are often called asylum seekers in the UK, for instance, which in the press portrays them as people coming in and wanting what we have, rather than refugees who are fleeing from hunger or from violence or from turmoil. But there are also other groups who are oppressed and marginalized. We talk about these in the book too, that don't get on the bandwidth so much. Some people are marginalized or oppressed because of their faith. And they might include Muslim or Jewish, for example, but can also include historical Protestant groups. One of the most marginalized groups in Canada are Mennonite groups. Because of their relationship to the mainstream culture. Sometimes it's because of language. So we talk about French-speaking Canadians in Canada. For instance, it will be Welsh speakers historically, or Gaelic speakers within Wales or Ireland. It might be Hispanic, Spanish speakers within the United States. So we talk about how important it is not to gloss these things over or push them to one side, but to raise these questions openly with each other and with our students, and to not just celebrate different identities, but also not either or, but both and, but also to talk about the suffering and indignities and oppression that different groups have experienced over time.
Thank you, Andy. So how can we approach all of this in our schools? It can feel completely overwhelming for us because it's challenging just to keep up with transformations in our own identities or in our small circle of friends and colleagues. But when you're dealing with over 100 students in a classroom environment, or maybe over 3,000 students in a school, how can we kind of manage all of these different identities? So one of the ways, of course, is by having a lot of critical conversations with them. And when we do, we can discover that there are aspects of their identity that overlap with one another. And these can be particularly helpful in some contexts, or they can be particularly damaging in other settings. So this is a picture of Kimberly Crenshaw, who is famous for coming up with a $10 term. Okay, you're with a couple of professors, so you kind of need to get, a big $10 term. And the term is intersectionality. Now, some of you may have already come across this term. If you have, let's see if I get it right. I believe I have, because Andy and I studied a lot of this literature very closely for our book. What is intersectionality? So Kimberly Crenshaw is a lawyer who is studying women who are in battered shelters for women all the way back in the 1980s, so a long time ago. And what she tried to discern was the question, did we have enough tools to understand what was happening for women who were poor, who were Black, who were homeless, who maybe had a second language or a third language? Did we understand the ways in which all of these different aspects of their identity overlapped with one another and compounded with one another? So Crenshaw, quite early on, in a courageous move, she asked of anti-racist activists, are you sensitive enough to issues of gender? She asked the feminists, are you sensitive enough to issues of race? And she asked to both groups, are you sensitive enough to issues of class? So what Crenshaw really opened up was a series of critical analyses that are in schools, hospitals, social work settings, business settings, about the way that different forms of identity attributes can overlap, can be experienced by people as particularly detrimental. Now, what Andy and I tried to do in this book is we looked at those critical dimensions of intersectionality, and then we thought we should add in two more because of what our data was telling us. And the first of these was celebratory intersectionality. So that's where people look at different aspects of their identity, and they might say, I'm Hispanic, I'm gay, I have a mother in Mexico, I have a father here in the US, I'm Catholic, I have all these different parts of my identity, and I don't really care what the world puts on me. I'm going to celebrate them, and I'm going to be proud about these different aspects of their identity. And for our Canadian colleagues who are listening in, that Drake really represents that, okay, represents any number of attributes that could be seen as negative and flips those and celebrates those. So we have critical intersectionality, which Crenshaw really represented. We have celebratory intersectionality, which I think you can recognize in many of your students, maybe in yourself, maybe in your colleagues. And then there's a third dimension, which is conflicted intersectionality, which is when these different components come into a tension or a contradiction with one another. So Andy mentioned the Mennonite population in Ontario. We visited one school district where 8% of the population was Mennonite and spoke German at home. Now, this is a culture that in many ways is very traditional, very patriarchal, suspicious of the outside society, suspicious of a lot of its agendas, and wants to keep a studied distance from a lot of the things that are going on in the public schools of Ontario or in the US or wherever this population is based. So we wanted to look at these kinds of issues also. And then we found ourselves exploring issues of the working class, and particularly the white working class, and how they are represented or not represented in our discussions around identity. And the reason we wanted to start with all of you thinking about your own identities is you might have very important identities to you that somehow haven't made their way into the identity politics discussions, but they're still extremely important for you, very important for your role as an educator, and they might likewise be extremely important for your students. So how do we kind of work with all of these different identities? Now, one of the things that we are learning is that bringing in a lot of guilt and shame for any population that we're working with, whether it's students, whether it's colleagues, whether we're talking with family members, generally isn't an effective strategy for generating long-term sustainable change. It can provoke some reflection. It can provoke some introspection. But in terms of transforming the culture of our schools, it's extremely limited. So one book that Andy and I studied very closely is this new book, Getting to Diversity, What Works and What Doesn't. It's by Frank Dobbin from Harvard University and Alexandra Kalev from the University of Tel Aviv in Israel. And they review over 490 studies with over 78,000 people in them that have been going on for decades. And they find that not only have many of our interventions around promoting diversity failed in terms of an impact, but sometimes they've been counterproductive. So after workshops and after interventions, there are fewer women, fewer people of color hired into these organizations. What's going on? Well, Andy and I tried to understand this from the lens of education. We thought that there could be a number of problems here that reflect the breakdown that happens when educational change is imposed upon people. It's not wanted. When it's treated as a single event rather than a process that people are involved in over many years. When the people who are most affected by the change are not really involved in the planning or participation of it. When it ignores how when people are asked to give up something that they've really loved, that there's a sense of loss that goes along with that. There's also problems when people don't know what they're going to get from some interventions. And there's problems when you can't celebrate any successes. Finally, there's problems when the coaching is just based on compliance rather than learning. We think this is an opportunity for us. For some people, breakdowns in diversity, equity, and inclusion are an excuse to stop trying, to give up. For us, breakdowns are an indication that we have an opportunity to reframe our work, to think about it differently, to include people who might have felt left out or imposed upon. That's our invitation for all of you, and that's our exhortation for the work we need to do going forward.
So what we're really trying to do here through this book, through our data, through the relationships we've had with our schools, and through all the reading that we've done, based on the way we come at it with who we are, what our background is, who we've tried to engage with. We've had a lot of feedback. We sent this out to many people there, and amongst our endorsers, people who are LGBTQ, people who are Indigenous, people who grew up like me, kind of poor white working class, but surrounded with increasing immigration and racism. We've shared this with a lot of people in trying to build a book that tries to emphasize what we have in common and what can bring us together. That is also really encouraging about the differences that there are amongst us, as well as the things we have in common, and how we can see those in a positive and a productive way that help us learn and grow together and feel like we belong. At the same time as not shrinking away from the great oppressions, discrimination of all kinds that we have faced and continue to face within our society and our schools, to do all these things at the same time. And so in the final part of the book, we really try to do two things. The first is to say we need new narratives that are not based on guilt and shame, of dealing with the identity issues that we have raised here. They're not about opposition, about conflict, about self-interest and only my group. And just one aspect of that new narrative is a phrase that was at large in the province of Ontario. And just think about this. What is essential for some students is often good for all students. So the technology that we found helped students with learning difficulties or reading difficulties, for example, converting text to sound, have become helpful for all kinds of students with their learning, the way we use digital learning now. One thing that helps Indigenous students in many places is more learning outside, more learning outdoors, more learning on the land, more connecting to Indigenous traditions. And now, particularly after COVID, we've learned how much learning outdoors actually benefits all students, emotionally, cognitively, and establishing early relationships to nature and to sustainability. And when we advocate for different bathrooms that are available to students of all genders, mainly what that's doing when people do it seriously is it stops bathrooms being the last place that anybody in their right mind would want to go to in their school, to becoming better bathrooms for everyone, like bathrooms in restaurants or on airlines, where there's no such thing as segregated bathrooms, for example. So what's essential for some students is often good for all. That's part of the new narrative we would encourage people to have. And then secondly, next slide, Dennis, we set out a number of tools, and we just want to show you one of these, but there are a number in the final chapter. So next slide, Dennis. So, and yes, I say something in the chat box, guilt and shame are two different feelings. I've actually done a lot of work on the emotions of teaching and different emotions. So you're totally right about that. So it may be guilt or shame rather than guilt and shame. But anyway, we talk in the final part of the book, one thing we talk about is when you're a leader, it's your job somehow to hold discussions on these things with your staff, with your students, with your school board, with your parents, that you think about some guiding principles within your discussion. So just like when you have professional learning, you establish norms for how you will discuss things together. Think of these as norms, sympathy, not just empathy with I know how other people feel, but sympathy is I feel like they feel. I feel it with greater intensity. Come back to bravery in a second. Solidarity, focusing on what we can hold on to together that can drive us forward. Treat people with dignity. If somebody says something out of turn, if they say people of color rather than colored people, if they say straight white rather than cisgender, don't launch an attack on them or ban them from taking a job, which has happened in cases we know, Dennis, in Massachusetts very recently for just using the wrong word. But gently correct them and show generosity and show forgiveness and quickly move on. Don't perseverate on it. Be civil, be humble. Understand that all of us are not perfect. Have a sense of irony in relation to ourselves. Don't get too sanctimonious. Dennis talked about conflicting intersectionality. So people who are like me, poor white working class, I grew up in poverty, but it's still white and have the advantages of being white. It's conflicting. Within the Black Lives Matter movement, there were great differences between older and younger leaders in Black Lives Matter of how they were dealing with the issue over time. So a little bit of humility and a little bit of irony, and none of us thinking that we have all the answers, and whoever are our opponents have none of the answers. These things really matter. And the top right hand, like at 1 o'clock, is bravery. These conversations that we find ourselves locked in our schools can very quickly become divisive. And the danger is that we shy away from them and we avoid them as much as we can, or we hastily rush to one side or the other. So above everything, what you're going to need is bravery. And the bravery is like the bravery of the buffalo. So whenever there's a storm coming, what do most animals do? They see the storm and they run from it. They try to escape the storm, but the storm follows them. And soon they're not only running from the storm, but they're in the storm. And they and the storm are running together. Out on the plains, what does the buffalo do? It turns round to face the storm. It's hard at first, you can see, but they're not in the storm for long. And if they're prepared to face the storm, they can come out on the other side. So as a leader, when you're in the midst of this, don't run away from it like all the other animals. Be a buffalo. Turn into the storm. Come out on the other side. In fact, next slide, Dennis. Don't be a buffalo. Be a herd of buffalo. And try and create a world by getting closer to our kids and closer to each other, courageously, where identity becomes a thing that doesn't divide us, but identity becomes a thing that's important to all of us as we develop as human beings all over time, and that brings us together rather than driving us apart. That's what our book is seeking to do. You may not agree with all of it, but we hope you find that it will say things that you're not usually quite coming across, or that you felt but nobody's talking about, and that will bring them onto the table and make it easier for you to discuss with the people around you. In response to the final question, there are recommendations in the book. So these 12 guidelines are one of the tools, but we have other tools. And you'll find the tools in the last chapter about creating positive environments for relating to, thinking about, and bringing together different identities within our schools. So thank you for your question, Angel Prado.
And thanks to all of you for your kind attentiveness. So now, Morgan, I think we're over to you. Is that right?
Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope everybody has a good rest of their day.